You did not stop rescuing them because your heart became cold. You stopped because, for the first time, you saw that their helplessness was not always helplessness. Sometimes it was a method. Sometimes the crisis was real, but so was the advantage it gave them. And once you saw the advantage, your compassion could no longer remain innocent. Before that moment, every emergency seemed to contain the same silent command: come closer, understand more, give one more chance, carry what they cannot carry. Their distress reached you faster than your own doubt, and you responded before asking what part of the burden truly belonged to you. You believed this immediacy was proof of love. You thought your willingness to enter the burning room made you kinder than those who remained outside. What you did not yet see was that some people had learned to set the room on fire because they knew you would be the one to enter it. This does not mean their pain was false. Pain can be real and still be used. A person may genuinely suffer while arranging that suffering so someone else must answer for it. They may feel abandoned while repeatedly creating the conditions that make abandonment inevitable. They may fear consequences while quietly expecting you to stand between them and every consequence. Look carefully at what happened whenever you began to withdraw. The person who claimed to be powerless suddenly became remarkably capable. They could not change, but they could persuade. They could not take responsibility, but they could explain why responsibility belonged to you. They could not hear your exhaustion, yet they could detect the smallest movement of your distance. They forgot what you needed, but remembered every promise you had made during a moment of guilt. Their confusion disappeared whenever the arrangement itself was threatened. Their helplessness was selective. This was the detail you resisted because accepting it would change the meaning of everything you had been doing. As long as they were simply wounded, your role remained clear. They suffered, and you helped. They collapsed, and you carried. They became lost, and you returned them to the path. But once motive appeared, the story became more complicated. You began to see that you were not merely supporting them through difficulty, you were protecting them from the knowledge that their choices had consequences. Each rescue returned them to the same position from which the next crisis would begin. The shadow does not always appear as cruelty. Sometimes it hides inside vulnerability, where compassion is least willing to examine it. You could perceive what people felt, but you were reluctant to perceive what they wanted. You saw the frightened part inside them and ignored the part that knew exactly what it was doing. For years, you separated suffering from motive. If someone was wounded, you assumed their intentions must also be innocent. You treated pain as evidence of goodness. To question the behavior of someone in pain felt like an act of betrayal. That was the weakness hidden inside your empathy. You could feel what others were feeling, but you did not always ask where those feelings were leading you. You could sense their fear, shame, loneliness, and desperation, yet you hesitated to recognize the demand concealed within them. Feeling appeared pure to you. Motive felt darker. To recognize motive would force you to accept that vulnerability and manipulation can inhabit the same person without canceling each other. Someone can be wounded and still wound you. Someone can fear abandonment and still use that fear to control your departure. You kept your attention on their pain because the pain allowed you to remain compassionate without becoming discerning. It gave you something you could understand, soothe, and forgive. Their motive would have required a different response. It would have required distance. Distance felt cruel because you had confused closeness with goodness. You believed that seeing more deeply into another person should make you more willing to remain, but there are truths that do not deepen intimacy. There are truths that end participation, and their motive was not the most painful thing clarity would reveal. Eventually, you would also have to see what rescuing them had been protecting inside you. They called your rescuing loyalty, you called it compassion. But beneath both words was an arrangement neither of you wanted to name. They were allowed to remain unchanged, and you were allowed to remain necessary. That second truth was more difficult to face. Their motives were not the only motives becoming clear. Yours were becoming visible too. You had told yourself that you rescued because you cared more deeply than others. You believed your patience came from strength and that your endurance proved the purity of your love. Yet somewhere beneath that goodness lived a quieter need. Some part of you needed their need. Being needed gave your place in the relationship a certainty that love never seemed to provide. Love could change, affection could move elsewhere, gratitude could fade, but a crisis made you indispensable. When someone was falling apart, you no longer had to wonder whether they would choose you. Their collapse chose you for them. This was the hidden security inside your exhaustion. You hated being used, but usefulness protected you from a more ancient fear. If you were no longer the one who understood, forgave, repaired, and returned, you might discover that the relationship contained very little capable of holding you there. The rescue prevented that discovery. Every emergency postponed the question of what existed between you when nothing needed fixing. You remained occupied with their pain, so you would not have to feel the emptiness beneath the bond. This is why clarity did not initially feel like freedom. It felt like guilt. You saw what they were doing, but you also saw why you had permitted it. The arrangement had wounded you, yet it had also sheltered you from the possibility of being unnecessary. To stop rescuing them meant risking the loss not only of the relationship, but of the identity through which you had learned to earn love. The psyche often protects an attachment by hiding the bargain that sustains it. You see the frightened child, the abandoned partner, the misunderstood friend, the wounded soul. You do not see the private exchange taking place beneath your compassion. I will protect you from consequence, and you will protect me from insignificance. Neither side needs to speak this bargain aloud. It lives in repetition. They return with the same wound. You return with the same answer. They promise that this time will be different. You pretend to believe them because hope allows the role to continue without appearing like a role. But repetition eventually reveals what explanation conceals. A mistake seeks correction. A pattern seeks preservation. Once you understood this distinction, you could no longer respond as though every recurrence were accidental. You began to notice that your help rarely moved them toward freedom. It moved them toward relief. Freedom would have required them to surrender something. They might have had to release a privilege, face a consequence, abandon an excuse, or confront an image of themselves they had spent years protecting. Relief allowed them to keep everything and lose only the discomfort, and you had become very skilled at removing discomfort. You calmed the conflict before it taught them anything. You repaired what their behavior had damaged. You translated their cruelty into fear, their entitlement into insecurity, and their avoidance into confusion. You made their choices easier to survive without ever requiring those choices to change. This recognition altered the meaning of your kindness. What had once felt generous now carried a darker possibility. Perhaps your rescuing was not interrupting their destruction. Perhaps it was helping the destruction continue without becoming painful enough to stop. The thought disturbed you because it made your goodness less simple. You had always wanted to be the opposite of those who abandoned people in pain. You did not imagine that remaining too quickly could also become a form of abandonment. You were abandoning their capacity to meet themselves. You stepped between them and the mirror, then wondered why they never saw their own face. You translated every consequence into misfortune. You softened every confrontation into misunderstanding. You gave their shadow a language of innocence until even they could no longer distinguish what had happened to them from what they had chosen. Jung understood that what remains unconscious does not become harmless. It gains influence precisely because no one is willing to name it. The shadow does not disappear when it is treated gently. It merely learns to operate beneath the language of goodness. Your compassion had illuminated their suffering while leaving their intention in darkness. And from that darkness, the unseen motive continued directing the relationship. When their motives finally became clear, you felt an unfamiliar stillness. It was not hatred. It was not revenge. It was the end of confusion. You no longer needed to argue with the evidence or collect one more explanation. Their behavior had become coherent. What once appeared inconsistent now followed a pattern. They were not always failing to understand. Sometimes they understood and preferred the arrangement. They were not always incapable of changing. Sometimes change threatened a privilege they did not want to lose. They were not always unaware of your sacrifice. Sometimes your sacrifice was exactly what they were counting on. The clarity hurt because it removed the version of them you had been rescuing. You had not only helped the person standing before you, you had helped the person you believed they might become if they were loved correctly. Every rescue was an investment in that imagined person. You kept giving because you believed that one day the hidden goodness would feel safe enough to emerge. One day they would recognize what you had carried. One day your patience would awaken their conscience. One day they would look back and understand that your love had saved them from becoming the person they feared they were. But your patience did not awaken what their dependence allowed them to avoid. The future version of them became the reason you tolerated the present one. You loved their potential so intensely that their actual choices seemed temporary. Yet years can be lost inside something repeatedly called temporary. When motive became visible, potential lost its authority. You saw that change was not waiting for the correct amount of love. It was waiting for a decision only they could make. Your devotion could not make that decision for them, and every attempt to do so turned care into control. This was another truth you resisted. Rescuing had allowed you to influence the ending while pretending that you had surrendered it. If you could find the right words, offer enough patience, absorb enough pain, perhaps you could guide them toward the person you needed them to become. Your care contained an unspoken demand. Become worthy of what I have given you. Prove that my suffering had meaning. Do not make me face the possibility that I sacrificed myself for someone who intended to remain exactly where they were. The more you had invested, the harder it became to stop. Ending the rescue would not only expose them, it would expose the years you had organized around their transformation. You would have to grieve not merely the relationship, but the meaning you had assigned to your endurance. So you kept misreading clarity as bitterness. Whenever you recognized manipulation, you accused yourself of becoming suspicious. Whenever you sensed entitlement, you searched for the wound beneath it. Whenever your body tightened before their name appeared on the screen, you called yourself unkind. But your body had understood the arrangement before your conscious mind permitted the understanding. It knew that every conversation carried an assignment. It knew that their vulnerability would soon become your obligation. It knew that the expression of pain was often the opening through which your boundaries would be removed. You could feel the change in your breathing before you answered them. You could feel the heaviness arrive before they explained what had happened. Some part of you already knew that the conversation would end with their burden inside your body. Still, you answered, not because you had no awareness, but because awareness threatened your identity. The rescuer was the version of you that knew how to deserve a place. Without that role, you did not know whether your presence alone would be enough. This is why the end began when motives became clear. Motive transformed the situation from tragedy into choice. You could continue helping someone trapped by circumstances. It became harder to help someone who repeatedly arranged the circumstances and then handed you the emotional cost. Once choice entered the picture, rescue began to resemble cooperation. Your guilt did not disappear, but it lost some of its innocence. You could no longer say that you were only responding to pain. You were participating in a system that required you not to know what you already knew. They sensed the shift before you spoke of it. People who depend on your confusion are often highly sensitive to your clarity. Your silence felt dangerous to them. Your pause felt like rejection. The simple act of asking what they intended to do became, in their eyes, an act of cruelty. They did not merely want empathy, they wanted empathy without discernment. They wanted you to feel the wound while remaining blind to the strategy surrounding it. They wanted the part of you that understood everything except what the understanding was costing you. They wanted your compassion separated from your judgment, because compassion without judgment could always be redirected toward their need. But something in you had begun to refuse the separation. For the first time, you allowed yourself to perceive the whole person, not only the wound, but the will, not only the fear, but the choice, not only what had happened to them, but what they continued to make happen through you. This did not erase your compassion, it purified it of blindness. You could acknowledge their pain without accepting responsibility for ending it. You could understand the origin of their behavior without agreeing to become its destination. You could see the abandoned child within them while refusing to let that child govern the life of the adult standing before you. The moment you saw this, rescuing became almost impossible, not because their pain ceased to matter, but because your disappearance began to matter too. You finally saw that every time you entered their crisis, someone was left behind. That person was you. You had called the abandonment compassion because the word made the loss easier to bear. You had called it loyalty because loyalty sounded nobler than fear. You had called it love because love prevented you from asking what the relationship required you to destroy within yourself. But clarity had changed the name of what was happening, and once the true name appeared, the old role could no longer remain innocent. And this loss of innocence did not begin with them. It began inside you, in the place where perception had once been separated from permission. You had always noticed more than you admitted. You sensed the difference between someone who could not act and someone who did not want to lose what inaction provided. But sensing a truth and allowing yourself to respond to it were never the same thing. Long before you became the person others called compassionate, you learned that motives were dangerous to name. You could notice when sadness became a weapon, when silence became punishment, when helplessness gathered attention around itself. Yet the moment you described what you saw, the atmosphere changed. Your perception became the problem. You were told that you misunderstood, that you were too sensitive, that you were imagining intention where there was only pain. The adult who frightened you became the adult you were expected to comfort. The person who withdrew love became the person whose difficult history you were asked to understand. So you learned to translate motive back into suffering. It felt safer to believe they could not help themselves than to recognize that some part of them understood the effect they were having. Their wound preserved their innocence. Your compassion preserved the attachment. This created one of the earliest divisions inside your mind. Perception continued registering what was happening, but your conscious identity was trained to distrust what the perception implied. The body registered the pattern, the mind learned to acquit it. You did not begin rescuing through action. You began by interpreting their behavior in a way that made rescuing morally unavoidable. First, you rescued them inside your own understanding. You protected them from the meaning of their behavior. You gave every contradiction a kinder explanation, every broken promise a deeper wound, every demand the language of fear. Only after rescuing their image could you rescue them from the consequences. By then, helping no longer felt like a choice. It felt like the only response available to a person who understood the situation correctly. The interpretation had already decided the action. This is why advice about boundaries rarely reached the deepest layer. The difficulty was not simply that you could not say no. The difficulty was that you had constructed a version of reality in which saying no appeared morally unjustified. If they were truly powerless, how could you leave them alone with the burden? But their powerlessness was rarely examined. You accepted their explanation of the crisis without looking at the structure surrounding it. You listened to what they said they wanted, but not to what their repeated choices protected. You measured intention by confession rather than by outcome. People do not always know their motives in a clear or deliberate way. The unconscious does not announce itself honestly. It reveals itself through what a person repeats, what they defend, what they avoid, and what somehow continues to benefit them despite their complaints. A person may sincerely say they want peace while recreating conflict wherever peace begins. They may insist they want independence while rejecting every step that would reduce their dependence. Their conscious wish may be genuine, but another wish, concealed within the shadow, may be stronger. You were trained to respond only to the conscious wish. You helped the person who said they wanted to change. You did not confront the hidden part that needed failure to continue. When they returned to the old pattern, you assumed your help had been insufficient. So you gave more precise advice, more patience, more reassurance, more access to your time. You treated repetition as evidence that the wound was deeper than you realized, rather than evidence that the arrangement was serving something neither of you had named. The hidden motive was not always malicious. Often it was frightened, immature, and unconscious. They may have needed the crisis because ordinary intimacy felt unavailable to them. They may have learned that people came close only when something was wrong. Suffering became the only language through which they knew how to secure connection. But understanding the origin of a motive does not make participation harmless. This was the distinction you had avoided. You believed that once you understood why someone behaved as they did, you lost the right to protect yourself from the behavior. Understanding became a private sentence. The more you saw, the more responsible you felt. Other people could leave because they saw only the damage. You remained because you could see the frightened structure beneath it. Your insight became the argument used against your own freedom. This is how empathy turned into captivity without ever appearing cruel. No one needed to lock the door. They only needed to show you the wounded part that would suffer if you walked through it. You closed the door yourself and called the enclosure love. But their history could explain the wound without assuming responsibility for the choices being made in the present. You had been relating to what happened to them while being harmed by what they were now doing to you. Their past remained vivid. Your present became strangely invisible. Whenever you tried to bring your experience into the room, their pain expanded until there was no room left. Your hurt awakened their shame. Their shame became a new emergency. Soon you were reassuring them about the damage they had caused you. The conversation ended with you comforting the person who had crossed the boundary. They left feeling understood. You left wondering why telling the truth had made you feel guilty. This was not an accident of communication. It was the mechanism through which accountability was converted back into rescue. The moment attention approached their behavior, distress redirected it toward their wound. Your empathy followed the distress, and the original truth disappeared. They did not always plan this movement. They did not need to. A pattern can be manipulative without being consciously designed. The unconscious learns whatever protects it from an intolerable recognition. If collapse removes accountability, collapse becomes available whenever accountability approaches. Your role was to treat each collapse as unrelated to the truth that preceded it. You were expected to forget what the distress had interrupted. Their tears became the final meaning of the encounter. Their behavior vanished behind the intensity of their feeling, but feeling does not erase function. A reaction can be sincere and still serve as an escape. A person can genuinely feel overwhelmed by your boundary, while also using that overwhelm to pressure you into removing it. The sincerity of an emotion does not determine the innocence of its effect. This was the form of discernment you had been denied. You were allowed to ask whether someone was hurting. You were not allowed to ask what their hurt was asking you to surrender. You were permitted to witness the emotion but not to examine the demand concealed inside it. Once you began examining the demand, familiar interactions changed shape. The late call was no longer only a plea for comfort. It was also an expectation that your evening would remain available. The apology was no longer only remorse. It was also a request to restore access before behavior had changed. The confession of helplessness sometimes transferred responsibility. The promise to do better sometimes ended discomfort without requiring transformation. The crisis was sometimes less about finding a solution than finding another person willing to absorb the emotional weight of avoiding one. You saw how often the rescue ended exactly where their responsibility would have begun. You made the call they were afraid to make. You spoke the truth they did not want to say. You repaired the relationship they had damaged. You carried the guilt they refused to feel. Each time, the immediate tension decreased. They became calmer, and you experienced the familiar relief of having restored order. Yet nothing essential had changed. The tension had not been resolved. It had been relocated into you. You carried it afterward as fatigue, resentment, restless thought, and an obscure sense of contamination. They slept after being heard. You remained awake, replaying the problem as though it had become yours through contact. Something had been transferred. Your mind called the transfer empathy because that word preserved the image of goodness. But empathy is the capacity to perceive another person's feelings. It does not require you to become the place where those feelings are stored. Rescuing required something more than empathy. It required a confusion of boundaries so complete that their discomfort became evidence of your obligation. The worse they felt, the less choice you believed you had. Their intensity became authority. This is why some people escalated when you did not respond. A request became desperation. Disappointment became accusation. Your delay became abandonment. The emotional volume increased until you returned to the role that made the volume decrease. The pattern taught you that peace could be restored only through surrender. If you gave them what they wanted, the atmosphere softened. If you remained separate, the emotional pressure continued. Eventually, you learned to obey the pressure before it fully appeared. You answered quickly because you knew what delay would produce. You explained carefully because you knew what ambiguity would invite. You monitored their mood because the first sign of distress allowed you to prevent the larger scene. What appeared spontaneous was often highly conditioned. Your rescuing was not merely generosity, it was anticipatory submission. You acted before being asked because waiting for the demand felt more frightening than complying with it. By moving first, you preserved the illusion that the sacrifice had been freely chosen. The illusion mattered. If you admitted that you were afraid of their reaction, the relationship would no longer look like mutual care. You would have to see how much of your kindness had been organized around emotional consequence. You were not simply giving, you were preventing what might happen if you did not give. Their motives became clearer when you stopped focusing only on what followed your rescue and began noticing what preceded it. The carefully timed vulnerability, the sudden helplessness when responsibility approached, the affection that returned whenever your availability became uncertain. Their warmth often increased as your access decreased. They became tender when you were almost gone, reflective when consequences became real, grateful when the old arrangement needed to be restored. Once you returned, the urgency of their transformation faded. This did not mean every expression was false. Their tenderness may have been sincere in the moment. Their fear of losing you may have been real. But the expression also had a function. It preserved connection without changing the conditions that had endangered it. You had mistaken emotional intensity for psychological movement. A powerful apology felt like transformation because it moved you. A painful confession felt like truth because it exposed vulnerability. But transformation is not measured by what someone says while facing the possibility of loss. It is measured by what remains different after the danger of losing you has passed. When nothing remained different, you blamed their fear. Then you blamed the depth of the wound. Finally, you blamed yourself for expecting too much. Each explanation protected you from the simplest recognition. They wanted the relationship to feel repaired more than they wanted to repair what had damaged it. The distinction was severe because it left you with no dramatic enemy. You were not necessarily facing someone without feeling. You were facing someone whose feelings repeatedly served the preservation of a pattern. They might love you and still prefer the version of love that required your self-abandonment. Love and exploitation were not always opposites. Sometimes exploitation survived inside love because neither person could bear to examine what the love demanded. Their attachment to you may have been real, so was their attachment to what you did for them. This was why the relationship could feel intimate and strangely impersonal at the same time. They knew how to reach your compassion, but not always how to reach you. They recognized the signals that opened your care, yet remained unfamiliar with the person who existed when no one needed saving. When you were tired, uncertain, or unavailable, they seemed confused by your existence. Your limits felt like a personality change. Your needs appeared at the edge of the relationship as unwelcome information. They had bonded with your function and called the bond closeness. And you had participated because function felt safer than presence. To be useful was to know how to behave. To be known would have required you to reveal desires that might inconvenience them. Usefulness gave you a script. Presence exposed you to rejection. The rescuer could always earn another day inside the bond. The ordinary person beneath the role had no such guarantee. That person could express a need and receive nothing, could offer honesty and still be left, could stop performing goodness and discover who had never loved anything beyond the performance. Clarity brought you closer to that risk. The more accurately you saw their motives, the less convincingly you could perform ignorance. And without ignorance, every rescue began to feel like a betrayal committed with open eyes. You had crossed a threshold. Their pain still reached you, but it no longer erased the pattern. Their explanation still moved you, but it no longer replaced the evidence. Compassion remained, yet obedience had begun to separate from it. What frightened you now was not that you had misjudged them. It was that you had finally judged the arrangement accurately. You could feel the old reflex preparing to rescue, while another part of you remained still and watched. That stillness carried everything you had once forbidden yourself to know. Some part of you had known for a very long time, and now that knowing had finally been granted permission, it returned carrying everything you had buried in order to remain compassionate: anger, grief, and the unbearable recognition that many of your rescues had begun as acts of fear. The anger did not arrive cleanly. It came mixed with shame because it was not directed only at them. Part of it turned toward the years in which you had noticed the truth and continued anyway. You remembered every moment when your body withdrew before your mind stepped forward. You had not been completely deceived. You had repeatedly overruled yourself. This was difficult to admit because deception had protected your innocence. If you had never known, then your sacrifice remained pure. You had simply loved someone who misused that love. But if some part of you had always known, a more unsettling question appeared. What had made participation preferable to clarity? You could say that you were afraid of losing them. And this was true. You could say that guilt controlled you, and this was also true. Yet beneath the fear and guilt was another layer. One, the identity of the empath rarely wants to examine. The role gave you a kind of power. It did not feel like power because it exhausted you. It felt like responsibility. But inside the crisis, you became the most capable person in the room. You knew what others needed before they spoke. You understood their patterns better than they did. You could anticipate the collapse, calm the conflict, and restore order after everyone else had failed. Their helplessness gave your perception authority. Their confusion gave your strength a purpose. You may have resented the burden, but the burden also proved something about you that ordinary affection never could. You were the one who stayed, the one who understood, the one whose conscience was deeper than the selfishness surrounding you. This belief helped you endure the exhaustion because it transformed deprivation into moral significance. The shadow of the rescuer does not appear as obvious cruelty. It appears as the secret pride of being the least cruel person present. You may never say that you are better than them, but the comparison quietly supports the role. They avoid, you face, they take, you give, they collapse, you carry. This division keeps the relationship stable because each person receives an identity from the other. They remain the wounded one, and you remain the conscious one. They are spared from discovering their strength. You are spared from discovering your need. Your need was more difficult to reveal because you had built your worth around having fewer needs than everyone else. You knew how to be the container, never the contained. You could sit beside another person's despair for hours, yet struggle to ask them to remain beside yours for a few minutes. Rescuing allowed you to stay close without becoming vulnerable. The conversation could feel intimate because it was about them. You could enter their deepest wounds without exposing the unprotected places inside yourself. Their exposure created the appearance of mutual depth. They may have told you everything. You may have told them almost nothing that could alter the balance. You shared insight, patience, reassurance, and understanding, but these were capacities, not necessarily vulnerabilities. You revealed the person who could help while hiding the person who might need help and be refused. The imbalance was not maintained only by their taking, it was also maintained by your concealment. You did not allow the relationship to discover whether it could hold the whole of you. You offered the part most likely to be welcomed, then suffered because the hidden parts remained unseen. This does not excuse their motives. It reveals why those motives could operate for so long. A pattern survives when it protects something on both sides. Their helplessness protected them from responsibility. Your competence protected you from exposure. The arrangement looked unequal because you carried more of the visible labor. Psychologically, however, both of you were avoiding a confrontation with yourselves. They avoided the strength that would make rescue unnecessary. You avoided the vulnerability that might not be rescued at all. This was the shadow reversal. You had believed your greatest fear was being used. Beneath it waited another fear. If no one used you, perhaps no one would need you. If no one needed you, you would have to discover whether anyone desired your presence without the service surrounding it. Need had always been easier to trust than desire. Need created urgency. Desire could change its mind. A person who depended on you would return, even if they did not truly see you. Dependency offered continuity at the price of reciprocity. You resented that price while repeatedly entering relationships structured around it. People who required little from you could feel strangely distant. Their stability offered no obvious entrance for your care. You did not know how to become important without becoming necessary. A healthy person might appreciate your kindness while refusing to build their life upon it. They could solve their own problems, tolerate disappointment, and regulate emotions you had once been expected to manage. Around them, your familiar gifts seemed less urgent. This could feel like rejection even when it was freedom. The relationship seemed quieter, less intense, almost empty. There was no crisis to pull you past uncertainty and assign you a role. You had to arrive without knowing what function would guarantee your place. Intensity had become one of the ways you recognized connection, the rapid confession, the immediate dependence, the feeling that someone had finally found the one person capable of understanding them. You called this closeness because it bypassed the slower risk of being known over time, but being urgently needed is not the same as being gradually known. Urgency narrows attention around a problem, knowing widens attention toward a person. One consumes your capacity, the other becomes curious about your existence. The people you rescued were often deeply attentive to your capacity. They noticed changes in your energy because those changes affected what you could provide. Sometimes even their concerns seemed organized around how soon you might recover enough to resume the role. This was why rest did not always feel restorative. You were resting in order to become useful again. Your body was treated as an instrument whose limits required temporary maintenance. You rarely asked whether the life organized around that instrument was one you wanted. Over time, the cost appeared in forms that seemed unrelated. You lost interest in messages. The sound of the phone produced tension. Kind requests felt heavier than they should. You withdrew from people who had done nothing wrong because your capacity had already been claimed elsewhere. Your tenderness became rationed. The relationships that demanded the most received the first share, while the quiet people who respected your limits received whatever remained. Those least willing to exploit you were often given the least access to you. This was one of the cruelest consequences of the role. Chaos was rewarded with attention. Stability was rewarded with absence. The person who created urgency entered your life immediately. The person who waited respectfully continued waiting. This was another source of the anger. You had not only given too much to the people who demanded it, you had withheld yourself from the people who might have loved you without the demand. You did not intend this. Your nervous attention had simply learned to follow danger. The loudest distress felt most important. even when it was repetitive and avoidable. Quiet affection did not activate the same compulsion, so it was postponed until there was almost nothing left to give. Then you wondered why your life contained so many people in crisis and so few places of rest. You believed wounded people had selected you because of your unusual empathy. Sometimes this was true, but you had also selected them because their wounds provided immediate instructions for earning connection. A healthy bond asked something more uncertain from you. It asked you to arrive without a role, to speak before becoming useful, to reveal a preference without knowing whether it would be accommodated, to allow another person to contribute without correcting the way they did it. Receiving was especially difficult because receiving disturbed the moral order inside you. When someone helped, you felt exposed and indebted. You searched for a way to repay them quickly so the balance would return to familiar ground. You did not want to become what had harmed you. Because you associated need with manipulation, your own need felt dangerous. You feared that asking for support would place another person under the same pressure you had known. So you erased the need before it could become a demand. But disowned need does not disappear. It enters the shadow and seeks indirect expression. It appears as resentment when no one offers what you never requested. It appears as disappointment that others cannot sense you as accurately as you sense them. You may silently test whether anyone will notice your exhaustion without being told. When they do not, the old conclusion returns. No one cares as deeply as I do. Yet you have trained them to believe you are fine and trained yourself to reject help that arrives imperfectly. You have made your need invisible, then interpreted the invisibility as evidence that no one is looking. The rescuer's shadow contains a hidden expectation. If I understand you without being asked, you should understand me without being told. The expectation feels fair because it mirrors what you have given, but the gift itself was often produced by vigilance, not ordinary human perception. You learn to read minute changes because those changes once carried consequences. Others may not possess that vigilance. Their failure to anticipate you is not always indifference. Sometimes it is evidence that they expect you to speak from a self they assume has permission to exist. Yet speaking directly would remove the moral safety of being the person who asks for nothing. You would have to risk an answer. Unspoken need can remain perfect. Once spoken, it can be misunderstood, negotiated, or refused. Rescuing spared you from that ordinary humiliation. It kept you on the side of the giver, where refusal appeared to belong to you, but your refusals had rarely been free. You said yes to others so that you would never have to hear no for yourself. The anger beneath your care had been collecting around this contradiction. You gave what you were afraid to request, then resented others for accepting it. You offered endless availability, then despised them for believing the offer. The resentment frightened you because it appeared to contradict your compassion. In truth, it revealed the limits your conscious identity would not permit you to express. Your shadow had been saying no long before your mouth could form the word. It spoke through fatigue, avoidance, delayed replies, forgotten promises, and the sudden wish to disappear. It spoke through fantasies of turning off the phone and allowing everything to collapse without you. These fantasies did not make you cruel. They revealed how thoroughly your agency had been exiled. When a direct refusal feels forbidden, the psyche imagines total escape. What cannot be limited consciously returns as a desire to end everything at once. Part of you wanted them to feel what you had carried. You wanted the person who claimed they could not cope without you to discover exactly what your presence had concealed. You wanted the consequences to become undeniable, not only to them, but to you. This was the darker motive inside your withdrawal. You were not only seeking peace, some part of you wanted proof. If everything fell apart when you stopped helping, then the magnitude of your sacrifice would finally become visible. The wish for proof revealed how unseen you had felt. You had hoped gratitude would eventually repay the invisible labor, but rescue often prevents the rescued person from understanding what was avoided. They experience relief, not the full weight you removed. Because the disaster did not occur, your work appeared unnecessary. Because you remembered every detail, they never learned what forgetting would cost. Because you repaired each rupture, they could believe the relationship repaired itself. You became resentful not only because you carried too much, but because carrying it well made the burden disappear from everyone else's view. Your competence erased the evidence of your labor. The better you rescued, the less rescuing seemed to have occurred. Recognition then hardened into a painful temptation. You wanted to explain the entire pattern so clearly that they could no longer deny it. You wanted to reveal their motive, name every reversal, and force the hidden bargain into the open. You wanted one moment in which they would finally say that you had been right. But this could become the final rescue. You would still be doing the work of consciousness for them. You would still be arranging the insight, delivering the truth, and waiting for the correct transformation. Their self-recognition would remain another outcome you tried to produce. Clarity did not require their agreement. This was the loss your shadow resisted. If they never understood what they had done, you might have to leave without vindication. You might have to trust a truth that no apology confirmed. The old role wanted one final performance, one perfect explanation, one confrontation so precise that the arrangement would collapse beneath the weight of its own meaning. But patterns built to avoid recognition rarely surrender because recognition is spoken beautifully. They may turn your clarity into accusation, your exhaustion into selfishness, and your withdrawal into evidence that you never cared. The more accurately you name the motive, the more urgently the old arrangement may defend itself. You could already feel that defense approaching. The moment you stopped translating their behavior into innocence, you became dangerous to the identity they had preserved beside you. Your questions threatened the helplessness that had protected them. Your stillness no longer looked like compassion. To them, it began to look like betrayal. But what they called betrayal was simply the first moment you refused to betray yourself. Their accusation did not need to be accurate to reach you. It only needed to touch the identity you had spent years protecting. Selfish, cold, unforgiving. These words landed in the place where your goodness had always required confirmation from the people who benefited from it. At first, you tried to make the change gentle enough that no one would experience it as change. You answered less quickly, but still answered. You offered sympathy without offering a solution. You hoped they would adjust without forcing you to name what had become clear. But the arrangement had been built around more than your kindness. It had been built around your intervention. Sympathy did not make the call. Understanding did not absorb the consequence. Warmth without rescue left the responsibility in the place where it had originated. They felt this difference immediately. You were still listening, yet they said you were distant. You were still compassionate, yet they said you no longer cared. What they called care had always contained a specific outcome. You were supposed to remove the feeling they did not want to carry. When you no longer removed it, your presence seemed less valuable. The conversation became strained because there was nothing left for you to perform. Their problem remained theirs, and the silence made this ownership impossible to ignore. Some became more helpless when you stopped intervening. The difficulty suddenly appeared larger. Every possible action contained a reason it could not be taken. They repeated the obstacle from different angles, waiting for your discomfort to become involvement. You felt the old movement rise inside you. The wish to take control appeared, not only because you cared, but because watching avoidable suffering was almost unbearable. Their refusal to act created tension in you, and rescuing had always been the fastest way to end that tension. This time, you recognized the tension as part of the mechanism. Their discomfort entered the room, but it did not become an instruction. You could feel it without converting it into labor. The separation was small, yet it altered the entire relationship. When you asked what they intended to do, the question disturbed them. It sounded simple, but it returned the agency they had placed in your hands. What you experienced as responsibility being restored, they experienced as support being withdrawn. They may have said they did not know. You allowed the answer to remain. You no longer transformed their uncertainty into your responsibility. For the first time, not knowing did not summon you across the boundary between two lives. The silence that followed felt almost physical. It contained all the work you were no longer doing. No reassurance, no immediate plan, no promise that you would remain available until the crisis passed. The absence of rescue became visible as a presence of its own. This was when some people revealed more than they intended. Their vulnerability hardened into irritation. Their request became an accusation. They were no longer describing how much pain they felt. They were describing how wrong you were for allowing them to feel it. Motive often becomes clearest when the expected comfort is refused. As long as you complied, the relationship could appear tender, but when you remained separate, the hidden expectation stepped forward. Their pain had not merely been asking to be witnessed, it had been claiming authority over your behavior. You did not need to decide that they were evil. This was not a trial of their entire character. Motive is rarely pure. They could be frightened and entitled, wounded and controlling, attached to you and attached to what your presence prevented. Clarity did not simplify them into villains. It ended the simplification that had made them only victims. You could hold both truths without allowing one to erase the other. Their suffering explained the pattern. Their repeated participation preserved it. This was the mature burden of seeing. It offered no clean innocence for either of you. They had used what you gave. You had used their need to secure your place. They resisted responsibility. You resisted the possibility that your sacrifice would never transform them. When the bargain became conscious, it could no longer operate with the same authority. You still felt guilt, but the guilt no longer proved that you were wrong. It was the emotional residue of a role losing its function. For years, guilt had arrived before every act of self-protection. You interpreted its presence as moral guidance. Yet guilt can arise whenever a deeply conditioned loyalty is broken. Even when that loyalty has become destructive, the feeling said you were abandoning them. The evidence said you were ceasing to interrupt the consequences of their choices. These were not the same event, but inside the old role, they had always been given the same name. You began to understand why people who had tolerated your exhaustion could not tolerate your clarity. Exhaustion had never threatened the arrangement. You could complain, cry, disappear briefly, and still return to the same function. Clarity was different. Exhaustion said you needed rest. Clarity said the role itself had become impossible. Rest could restore your usefulness. Clarity removed the belief that usefulness was love. This was why apologies sometimes arrived when your understanding became firm. Some were sincere, but sincerity alone no longer persuaded you. You listened for what the apology was meant to restore. Did it make room for the truth, or did it hurry you past it? Did it acknowledge a choice, or describe another wound? Could the person remain present with the effect of their behavior without turning their shame into your next burden? Some could not. The moment you named your experience, they collapsed beneath it. Their collapse placed you back in the familiar position. You could continue speaking and feel cruel, or stop speaking and restore their innocence. Previously, you stopped. This time, you allowed the discomfort to remain between you. You did not punish them. You simply refused to erase yourself in order to make the conversation bearable. They may have called this a lack of compassion, but compassion that requires the disappearance of the witness is not compassion. It is protection from reality, purchased through another person's silence. Others responded differently. They withdrew. Once rescue was no longer available, the intimacy they had displayed began to fade. Messages became shorter. Affection cooled. The person who had once said that no one understood them like you suddenly seemed to need very little from you. This loss was painful because it confirmed what you had feared. Some bonds had been sustained less by who you were than by what happened in your presence. When the relief disappeared, so did the urgency of the connection. You may have wanted to restore the old warmth simply to prove that the relationship had been real. One act of rescue could have brought them close again. You knew the exact words that would soften them and the exact offer that would reopen the bond. But the knowledge itself exposed the bargain. If closeness could be purchased only through self-abandonment, restoring it would not prove that you were loved. It would only prove that the old payment still worked. So you allowed some relationships to become quiet, not as punishment, not as a strategy intended to make them return differently. You simply stopped supplying the force that had kept them artificially near. The quiet revealed which connections could survive without crisis. A few people remained, but seemed uncertain. They had known you through the pattern and did not yet know how to approach you outside it. Their confusion was not necessarily exploitation. It was evidence of how thoroughly the role had replaced the relationship. They asked what was wrong because they had rarely encountered your separateness. You had been so responsive that an ordinary limit looked like injury. You had been so accommodating that a preference looked like anger. Even people who genuinely cared for you could experience the change as loss. They had organized parts of their lives around your reliability. Your clarity disrupted conveniences they may never have consciously examined. Their disappointment was real, even when their intention was not malicious. You no longer needed every negative reaction to prove manipulation. That would have been another form of certainty, another way to avoid the vulnerability of seeing each person accurately. Motives became clear through patterns, not through suspicion alone. Some people were capable of adjustment. They felt discomfort without turning it into punishment. They learned to ask rather than assume. They began to hear no without treating the word as abandonment. Their willingness did not erase the past, but it changed the meaning of the present. They were not demanding innocence. They were allowing the relationship to become conscious, even when consciousness removed privileges they had once enjoyed. Others continued trying to return you to the old position. They reminded you of everything they had suffered. They described the new distance as evidence that you had changed. They spoke about the person you used to be with, a tenderness they had rarely offered while that person was exhausting themselves. You heard what was hidden inside the nostalgia. They missed the version of you who made their motives unnecessary to examine. They missed the person whose empathy converted every pattern into a reason for one more chance. They remembered that you were always there, but forgot how often your presence had been obtained through guilt, urgency, and fear. You attempted to correct the history, to explain that the old you had not been endlessly loving, the old you had often been afraid. The availability they romanticized had frequently been a form of obedience, but explanation could not guarantee recognition. People attached to your former role might hear only accusation. They could argue over details and demand that you prove a pattern you had lived inside for years. You began to see that being understood was not required for the role to end. This recognition carried grief rather than triumph. You had spent so long believing that a shared understanding would release you both. Perhaps they would finally see. Perhaps you could leave the arrangement without becoming the villain in their story. But the desire to control their story was another thread connecting you to the rescue. You wanted to save them from misunderstanding you because their misunderstanding threatened your self-image. If they called you cruel, part of you still wanted to perform enough goodness to change their verdict. This was the final motive becoming clear. You had not rescued only to prevent their suffering. You had rescued to prevent yourself from being experienced as the cause of suffering. Their approval protected you from your own shadow. To stop rescuing meant allowing someone to feel pain in your presence without immediately proving that you were innocent of it. They might feel abandoned. They might become angry. They might suffer consequences that your intervention had once delayed. But another person's pain was not automatic evidence of your wrongdoing. The fact that you could prevent pain did not make every pain yours to prevent. This was the distinction the old role could not tolerate. It had treated capacity as obligation. If you could help, you believed you must help, regardless of what the help preserved. But rescue is not neutral when it conceals motive. It teaches the other person that enough distress can transfer the burden. It teaches you that enough guilt can erase your perception. Each repetition strengthens the structure. Both people claim to want to escape, Your refusal interrupted this lesson. It did not guarantee change. They might find another rescuer, create another crisis, or tell another version of the story in which your withdrawal caused everything that followed. Their future remained beyond your control. This was precisely what made stopping feel so severe. You had to surrender not only responsibility for the outcome, but the fantasy that your continued sacrifice could eventually make the outcome good. The grief came from recognizing that some people would choose the pattern even after its motive had become visible. They would choose familiar suffering over unfamiliar responsibility. They would choose someone who removed consequences over someone who saw them clearly. You could care about the frightened place inside them and still refuse the role that frightened place demanded. Compassion did not need to become contempt before rescue could end. It needed only to become conscious of what its labor was protecting. What changed was not your capacity to feel their pain. You could still sense the fear beneath their anger and the shame beneath their helplessness. The difference was that these feelings no longer erased the adult standing before you. You saw the wound, the motive, and the choice together. None cancelled the others. This fuller perception made rescuing impossible, because rescue had depended on reducing the person to the part that possessed no agency. Once you saw the whole person, you could no longer pretend that their woundedness made every choice inevitable. For the first time, you did not prove your empathy by carrying what they refused to face. You allowed their life to remain attached to their decisions. And you allowed your life to return to you without demanding that they bless the separation. There was no dramatic freedom in this. The phone could still ring, and your body could still prepare to answer in the old way. Guilt could still move through you like a memory of danger. The impulse to explain, repair, and return could still appear, but the motive was visible now. Once seen, it stood between impulse and action. You could feel compassion without converting it into obedience. You could witness distress without accepting the assignment hidden inside it. You could remain present without disappearing. Your heart had not become cold. You could still feel their pain, but pain was no longer enough to erase motive, choice, and consequence. Compassion remained. What ended was the obedience that had hidden inside it. You no longer mistook the invitation to disappear for an invitation to love. The rescuing ended not when you stopped caring, but when caring no longer required you to remain blind.